Hey guys, tonight we ease into a story from the northern quarters of Naples, where streets twist like alley cats and whispers seem to outnumber street lamps. The air here is thick with laundry strung between balconies, scooters buzzing past, and a pulse that never quite rests. We are stepping into the world of Francesco Mallardo, remembered in hushed tones as the Fox of Naples North. His name carried both fear and curiosity because he moved differently, cautious, deliberate, never loud. You probably won't survive this world for a day, not because of bullets whistling through the night, but because the weight of suspicion alone could grind you down. A wrong word, a careless glance, could cost you everything. The Fox thrived here, among the crowded tenements and worn piazzas, and tonight we'll follow his path. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love for you to post your location and local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where these stories drift and at what hour they find you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Francesco Mallardo begins his tale in the sprawl of Scampia and Giuliano, places often painted as epicenters of poverty and opportunity alike. These districts, crisscrossed with concrete blocks built during the 1970s boom, became both shelters for families and fortresses for clans. Kids grew up learning which stairwell belonged to which faction, which cafe tables were safe, and which corners you avoided after dark. He was born into a family already marked by the Camorra's shadow. The Mallardo clan wasn't the biggest in Naples, nor the most flamboyant, but they were rooted, respected, and feared enough to carve their slice of the north. From childhood, Francesco absorbed the codes of silence, loyalty, and patience. Unlike the loud-mouthed boys who dreamed of guns and fast cars, he learned to listen, to wait. Italy in the 1980s and 1990s was scarred by mafia wars, not just in Naples but in Sicily, Calabria, and beyond. Historical fact: in 1980 alone, Naples saw over 200 mafia-related murders, a staggering reminder of how everyday life could be punctuated by sudden violence. Growing up in such an environment, Francesco sharpened instincts that would later define him: the ability to blend, to vanish, to make decisions without drawing fire. Neighbors remember him not as a bully, but as a boy with sharp eyes, someone who rarely spoke unless he had something to say. One elderly woman once remarked, "That child, he watches like a fox." The nickname stuck, though it would take years before it reached newspapers. He saw men come and go, some swaggering with temporary power, others disappearing overnight when alliances shifted. Those early lessons stayed with him. The Camorra was never a stable institution. It was a shifting web of loyalties. A young Francesco understood better than most that survival meant knowing when to step forward and when to stay invisible. Even as a boy, he would run errands between markets, carrying small packages with a straight face, never peeking inside. Family members whispered about how trustworthy he was, how he kept secrets even from cousins. In communities like Giuliano, this silence was gold. Do you remember the day he left with the first money tucked into his pocket? For him, it wasn't about the coins. It was about learning the weight of responsibility. The image of Naples, vibrant and ancient, forms the canvas of his story. Tourists saw pizza ovens, Vesuvius looming in the distance, and music spilling out of taverns. Locals like Francesco saw survival, strategy, and the quiet dance of power beneath the surface. The Fox was growing up, watching, waiting, and storing lessons that would one day make him one of the most elusive figures in Camorra history. Scampia, with its looming Vele towers, is where the outline of Francesco Mallardo's story really begins to take shape. Concrete giants stretch skyward, angular and alien, casting shadows across open courtyards where kids kick battered footballs and stray dogs nose through scraps. These buildings were meant to be monuments of modern urban planning. Yet by the 2000s, they had become symbols of abandonment, spaces where the Camorra's invisible hand could tighten its grip on daily life. Francesco's childhood wasn't wrapped in luxury, but he wasn't deprived either. His family's position meant there was always food on the table and a protective circle around his movements. Still, he lived in the same air as everyone else, crowded hallways smelling of fried anchovies, arguments spilling through thin walls, and the ever-present hum of scooters delivering both groceries and illicit goods. Here, a boy learned fast which doors to knock on and which to pass in silence. The Mallardo clan had roots in Giuliano in Campania, a town north of Naples. For generations, they had built their reputation quietly, avoiding the flamboyant wars that scarred other families. By the time Francesco was growing, Giuliano was their heartbeat, a place where cousins, uncles, and elders held court in cafes, exchanging coded phrases about construction contracts and favors that smoothed local politics. Francesco absorbed these gatherings like a student at an unspoken school, watching men who didn't need guns at their hip to command respect. One mainstream fact: Giuliano became known as the largest town in Italy not classified as a city, with a population exceeding 100,000 by the late 20th century. Its size made it fertile ground for both legitimate commerce and Camorra infiltration. For Francesco, this meant opportunity was all around, if you knew how to take it without drawing unnecessary light. Relatives describe him as reserved, but never timid. He had a quiet confidence, the sort of presence that made older men nod approvingly. When boys his age fought over who could ride a scooter fastest, Francesco lingered near the men at cafe tables, listening to stories about past alliances, betrayals, and the eternal chessboard of Naples' underworld. It was here he first learned about the bitter feuds between the Mallardo clan and rivals like the Mesto family, names that carried heavy histories. Even as a teenager, he demonstrated an uncanny ability to remember details. Someone might mention a contractor's cousin who owed a favor, and weeks later, Francesco would recall the exact name and circumstance. His relatives began calling on him to handle errands that required discretion, delivering sealed envelopes, relaying subtle messages, arranging introductions. This wasn't glamorous work, but it built trust. A fox doesn't charge into the field. It prowls the edges, waiting for the right opening. Naples of the 1990s was already reeling from the echoes of Raffaele Cutolo's reign, the Nuova Camorra Organizzata that had once terrorized the region. Many people still think that the aftermath of Cutolo's wars permanently fragmented the Camorra, making it less centralized but more resilient. So what do you think? Was this fracturing a weakness? Or did it actually make space for quieter figures like Francesco to thrive? Among his peers, he stood out not by dominance but by restraint. When tempers flared, he'd walk away, and that act alone sometimes won him more respect than throwing fists. He had no desire to be the loudest voice in a room. He wanted to be the one who, when he finally spoke, made others fall silent. That patience, that calm, earned him the reputation that would later define his adult years. Do you remember the way his neighbors described his gaze? Sharp, observant, never hurried. That gaze, even as a boy, suggested he was collecting information others discarded. And in a world where the wrong whisper could be fatal, information was the true currency. The fox of Naples's north was not born with a crown. He grew up under concrete shadows, in hallways echoing with survival. And as his childhood days stretched into adolescence, the lessons of Scampia and Giuliano stitched themselves into the fabric of his character, preparing him for the complex web of alliances, betrayals, and power that lay ahead. Family in Naples is more than blood. It's a fortress, a refuge, and sometimes a trap. For Francesco Mallardo, the strength of his surname opened doors, but also drew eyes. The Mallardo clan of Giuliano was already a recognized force by the 1990s, entrenched in extortion rackets, construction deals, and the kind of political influence that made them untouchable in their stronghold. Francesco didn't grow up asking what the family business was. He simply breathed it in, as natural as the sea breeze carrying the scent of Vesuvius. At family gatherings, he would sit quietly at the edges, watching uncles and elders converse in half-sentences. The language of his household wasn't about declarations. It was about pauses and raised eyebrows, about names spoken softly over plates of pasta. Children learned early that going to see an old friend might mean a debt collection, or that helping with a problem could involve leaning on a contractor. For Francesco, this coded language became second nature. One mainstream historical fact: Naples, by the late 20th century, had the highest unemployment rate in Italy, especially among the youth. In such an environment, families like the Mallardos were more than criminals. They were employers, protectors, and providers of order when the state seemed absent. To locals, loyalty to a clan often felt safer than loyalty to distant institutions. Francesco's direct ties meant he was destined to step into leadership. His father and uncles had been figures of authority, commanding both fear and respect. He inherited not just their name, but their enemies. Families like the Maistos, whose feuds with the Mallardos had left scars in Giuliano. Stories of blood spilled in past decades lingered, reminders that any misstep could reignite violence. Unlike other heirs of Camorra dynasties, Francesco showed little taste for the spotlight. While others his age might flaunt luxury cars or designer clothes, he preferred to keep things understated. A neat shirt, polished shoes, nothing that screamed for attention. It was a tactic as much as a personality trait. The fox doesn't bark. It slips through hedges unseen. Among his cousins, he was often the one chosen for errands that required finesse rather than muscle. An older uncle once said, "If you need a gun, send someone else. If you need the job done right, send Francesco." That reputation spread, and slowly, even seasoned clan members began to treat him with a subtle deference. Do you remember the day when he accompanied his uncle to a meeting with contractors bidding on a Giuliano project? While the older men talked in circles, Francesco leaned back, silent, scanning faces. Later he whispered to his uncle which man was lying about costs, and sure enough, the lie unraveled within days. That sharp perception wasn't lost on the family. It marked him as more than just another heir. It marked him as the strategist in the making. Many people still think that Francesco's eventual authority came purely from bloodline, that anyone with the Mallardo name could have filled the role. Yet, his own clan whispered differently. They saw how he held silence longer than most, how he stored details like weapons in a hidden cache. So what do you think? Was he simply lucky to be born into the right family? Or was his rise already etched in his temperament, even in his youth? Francesco understood that family ties were both shield and chain. They gave him the network, the trust, and the platform to rise, but they also tied him to old vendettas and obligations. And as he stepped further into adulthood, those same ties would test his ability to lead with the cunning that earned him the name the Fox. There's a moment, quiet but unmistakable, when a boy becomes a player. For Francesco Mallardo, it doesn't come with a bang or blood, but with a whispered agreement behind a shuttered cafe on Via Colonna. He's barely in his 20s, lean and sharp-eyed, his posture calm but unreadable. And yet, the men twice his age lean toward him when he speaks. A gesture is made, an envelope passed, and though it looks like nothing more than a casual meet-up, the older men know. The kid is no longer just running errands. He's making moves. The earliest signs of his power are subtle. He doesn't demand territory. He reorganizes it. He doesn't issue threats. He brokers silence. In the dense streets of northern Naples, where motorcycles screech past graffiti-tagged walls and iron grates cover most windows, Francesco builds his foundation not on fear, but on precision. That's his currency. Order in a world known for chaos. There's a reason the local dealers start checking with him before making decisions. It isn't that he's the loudest voice in the room. It's that he knows which voices actually matter. He learns which police officers have gambling habits, which waste collectors know more than they let on, which shopkeepers can be trusted to pass messages under bags of bread, while other young men are still puffing their chests in nightclubs. Francesco is mapping the neighborhood in his head, one favor at a time. One mainstream fact: Naples has long been one of the most surveilled cities in southern Europe due to organized crime. But in this tangle of cameras and informants, Francesco learns to operate like vapor. His early operations never tie directly to him. His name doesn't appear on papers, and yet things happen when he nods. The first real test comes when a local gang of street dealers, untied to any major clan, starts getting greedy. They push product too close to a Mallardo-run corner. Tensions build. His uncles want to send muscle, make a statement. Francesco suggests something else. Instead of violence, he sends an emissary to offer the rivals better supply lines, on the condition they absorb into the network under his terms. They accept. No bloodshed, no retaliation, just a quiet absorption. And just like that, Francesco expands his reach without firing a shot. His peers begin to notice that this isn't the old Camorra style. It's cleaner, more corporate. Instead of shootouts, there are ledgers. Instead of bribes, there are shares. A cousin once said, "He doesn't lead like a boss. He leads like a banker with bodyguards." The Fox, it seems, isn't just sly, he's scalable. Do you remember when his older cousin Marco tried to undercut him on a deal? Francesco found out, of course. But instead of confrontation, he staged a subtle shift. He redirected a contract Marco wanted to a rival, costing him prestige. No threats, just a gentle, elegant punishment. A fox doesn't chase. It waits until the path narrows. This was the beginning of Francesco's distinct style. No headlines, no chaos. In fact, the more power he accumulated, the quieter his name became. In a world of men eager to be feared, Francesco preferred to be trusted, or better yet, underestimated. And that, in Camorra circles, is more dangerous than a bullet. By the time he reaches his mid-20s, he's already coordinating minor logistics in Giuliano's smuggling operations. Cigarettes, counterfeit fashion, small arms. Not the flashiest trades, but the most consistent. And through every shipment, every truck, every port handshake, Francesco keeps his hands technically clean. Many people still think that in these early years, he was just a shadow for his father's generation, too young to be more than a puppet. But the trail says otherwise. So, what do you think? Is silence always submission? Or can it be something far more strategic? Because even now, as he's rising, there are no photographs of him leading meetings, no recordings of his voice giving orders, just a growing network of men who look to him before acting, and a city that doesn't yet realize it has a fox slipping through its cracks. Some men rule with noise. Francesco Mallardo rules with pauses. It's in the way he walks into a room, measured steps, nods instead of greetings, eyes that seem to catalog every exit and weak point. The other men speak too much, boast too loud. Francesco? He waits, and when he finally does speak, no one interrupts. They call it cunning. Others just call it survival. But whatever you name it, the effect is the same. When Francesco is in the room, even the veterans adjust their posture. By the early 2000s, his reputation starts slipping beyond the bounds of Giuliano. Men from Secondigliano, Melito, and even central Naples begin to mention the young Mallardo with a certain note of caution. Not because of violence, he rarely orders it. Not because of money, though he has more than enough, but because he never seems to make a mistake. In a world where pride gets most men killed, Francesco is surgical in how he navigates territory, alliances, and risk. When rival clans clash over turf, he stays silent. When the police sweep the blocks, he's already made sure none of his people are caught with anything actionable. If something falls apart, it's never his corner. He becomes known for what doesn't happen. A dispute is settled before it erupts. A rival suddenly steps back from expansion plans. A contractor, once hesitant, suddenly agrees to Mallardo terms without needing a visit from armed men. The Fox's genius is that he makes others think they came to their decisions alone. One mainstream historical fact. During this time, the Camorra's structure was fracturing. Unlike the Sicilian Cosa Nostra with its rigid hierarchy, Camorra clans began operating more like loose federations. This made violence more common, unpredictability more dangerous, but it also created gaps. Gaps Francesco could slip through. Many people still think that without a formal pyramid, Naples's criminal landscape was doomed to chaos. But what do you think? Was it chaos? Or just a new ecosystem where cunning had more value than brute force? Francesco clearly saw the shift. He watched as flamboyant bosses met dramatic ends. Cutolo, Di Laro, the men who lived loudly and fell harder. He took notes. Power had to be mobile, invisible, adaptable, like breath in winter air, seen only when you want it to be. He began shaping a philosophy of power built around three principles: never be the first to speak, never owe a favor you can't repay, and never fight a war you don't already know you'll win. Simple rules. But in the hands of a strategist like Francesco, they became the backbone of something far more durable than most empires. Do you remember the old warehouse off Via Appia that suddenly turned into a logistics hub? No one knew who owned it, yet shipments flowed in and out, always on time, always protected. Francesco's fingerprints weren't on the lease, but the men working there all came from Giuliano. That was his style. Quiet stewardship. A local priest once joked, "I don't know if Francesco believes in God, but I know God wouldn't start a fight with him." And yet, despite all his moves, there are no pictures of him at clubs, no videos of him throwing money around, no drunken nights that ended in scandal. He doesn't crave the spotlight. He cultivates the shadows. The media begins to use the nickname Il Volpe, the fox, and it fits too well. Cousins running smaller operations look to him not for orders, but for approval. His power is like gravity, silent, constant, impossible to escape. He doesn't bark. He doesn't threaten. He simply rearranges the board until his enemies find themselves in check without even noticing the move that got them there. By now, the older generation has taken notice. His father, once the unchallenged patriarch, begins stepping back. Not officially, of course. Appearances matter. But the real decisions? Those come from Francesco now. And no one protests. Because when the fox starts to move, the wise man doesn't ask why. He simply steps aside. The fox doesn't hunt alone forever. Eventually, he finds others moving through the brush. Different coats, but similar pace. For Francesco Mallardo, that companion comes in the form of the Licciardi clan. Based in the sprawling, tightly wound streets of Secondigliano, the Licciardis weren't strangers to ambition. Their late boss, Gennaro Licciardi, known as Asigna the Monkey, had built a legacy of influence before his death in the early 1990s. But it was his sister, Maria, who would truly elevate the family name in Camorra folklore. Maria Licciardi, sharp, composed, relentless. She ran her operation like a CEO in a tailored suit. Where others sought fear, she sought profit. And when Francesco began to rise in Giuliano, Maria noticed. He wasn't knocking at her door, but she felt the tremors of his growing influence just the same. The 2000s weren't kind to flashy clans. Police were everywhere. Wiretaps buzzed constantly, and men who once strutted in leather jackets now whispered through prison phones. But Francesco and Maria shared something rare in this world: discipline. One mainstream historical fact. After the 2000 arrest of Paolo De Lauro's inner circle, the Camorra saw a surge in fragmentation, with over 100 microclans emerging in greater Naples. Alliances became necessary for survival. It wasn't just about territory anymore. It was about endurance. And so, the fox and the lady formed an alliance. Not out of desperation, but calculation. Francesco brought structure and reach from Giuliano. Maria brought resources, street-level control, and institutional knowledge. Together, they could operate like a single breath over 2 lungs. Their pact was quiet, sealed not by blood oaths, but by mutual benefit. Francesco began allowing Licciardi contacts to move product through his northern corridors. In return, Maria opened access to infrastructure, safe houses, distribution channels, even political intermediaries. It was a marriage of stealth and strength. Many people still think that Maria Licciardi was the true strategist of the alliance. Others say Francesco was the silent architect, the one who let others take the heat while he positioned the board. So what do you think? Was their partnership balanced, or was one shadow longer than the other? Do you remember the warehouse district near Lago Patria that suddenly came alive? It wasn't just boxes moving in and out. It was a sign. A new network was taking shape. Not a family, but a coalition. And Francesco was now part of something bigger, something modern. At meetings, he and Maria rarely raised voices. They didn't need to. One glance, one shared silence, was often enough to reroute strategy. Francesco respected her clarity. She respected his patience. Together, they began ironing out the reckless sparks that plagued other alliances. One of their earliest joint projects was a logistics corridor connecting the northern ports to inland Naples, a critical artery for moving not just contraband, but influence. Francesco oversaw the flow like a conductor, while Maria handled security and cash washing. Their style contrasted with the street bosses who ran with guns out and phones on speaker. They preferred binders, middlemen, and prepaid cards passed in bookstores. And still, there were no headlines, no leaked photos, no scandals, just results. That was the difference. Whispers on the street began to evolve. That corner belongs to Mallardo, but check with Licciardi first. Or, Maria runs the house, but Francesco holds the key. It was never clear who truly led, which was exactly how they wanted it. The fox had found a fellow tactician, and together their influence spread, not like wildfire, but like fog. Slow, quiet, complete. It wasn't loyalty that kept this alliance intact. It was logic. Francesco and Maria both knew that in this era of surveillance and betrayal, partnerships based on ego crumbled fast. But those based on shared purpose, those endured. Long before Francesco Mallardo sat at the table of modern alliances, there was blood in the streets of Naples, thick and unrelenting. The ghosts of past wars still lingered, particularly the legacy of the Nuova Familia, a loose coalition of Camorra clans that had, in the 1980s, risen up to crush the terrifying hold of Raffaele Cutolo's Nuova Camorra Organizzata. That war, which left hundreds dead, reshaped Naples permanently. Though Francesco had been just a boy then, the memories of those years lived on in family stories. Murders in daylight, judges gunned down, entire neighborhoods placed under curfew by the fear of which clan held power that week. His own clan, the Mallardos, had taken part in those alliances, fighting alongside the likes of the Alfieri and Nuvoletta clans. But Francesco, he didn't inherit the trauma, he inherited the map. One mainstream historical fact: the Nuova Familia's victory over Cutolo's NCO was less a win for peace and more a redistribution of violence. Once Cutolo was weakened, the coalition itself fractured, and the Mallardos emerged as quiet winners in Giuliano. Francesco grew up learning what that meant. Victory wasn't about celebration. It was about sustainability. His uncle spoke of those years not with pride, but with fatigue. Blood got you power, yes, but not peace. Francesco took that to heart. He understood that real dominance came not from erasing enemies, but from making sure there were none to begin with. Still, the legacy of the Nuova Familia lingered like a lesson carved in stone. Old alliances could break without warning. Families that once stood side by side could fall into silent hostilities overnight. Trust, Francesco knew, wasn't an asset. It was a liability unless carefully rationed. Do you remember when an old-timer from the Alfieri clan approached him for a favor, referencing how our fathers fought together? Francesco nodded, listened, but gave nothing. He wasn't interested in nostalgia. He was interested in leverage. This distance, this refusal to romanticize the past, became one of his defining traits. Many people still think that his cool demeanor was arrogance, a coldness that made him less human. But what do you think? Was it really detachment, or simply a clearer understanding of the game's stakes? Francesco respected history, but he never let it pull him backward. He understood that the players who survived the 2000s were not the ones waving old flags. They were the ones who could rewrite the rules. So while others clung to the alliances born during the Nuova Familia's time, Francesco built his own network, not out of sentiment, but out of necessity. If a partner was useful, he brought them close. If they weren't, he let them drift. No drama, no message sent, just silence. His strategy diverged sharply from the bloodier instincts of the past. Where his father might have arranged a vendetta, Francesco arranged a relocation. Where Cutolo's era had taught that power was shown through violence, Francesco demonstrated that true power could be quiet, almost invisible, like the hush before an earthquake. It wasn't that he couldn't be ruthless. It's just that he saw violence as a last resort, not a first move. And that alone made him dangerous in a way the old Dons never were. People began to say that the new Camorra wasn't ruled by bullets anymore. It was ruled by balance sheets and burner phones. That wasn't entirely true, but in Francesco's case, it came close, and through it all, he kept a mental ledger of those who clung too tightly to the past. Because history, to Francesco Mallardo, wasn't a road to walk, it was a cautionary tale, and the smarter foxes knew when to veer from it. It begins quietly, as most significant shifts do. A whispered tip about a port arrival here, a courier with a new contact there. By the time Francesco Mallardo lifts his gaze from the steady trickle of street-level profits, cocaine has already begun slipping into Naples with increasing regularity. The Colombians are expanding. The 'Ndrangheta is handling distribution in the south, and the Camorra, fragmented but hungry, is perfectly positioned to profit. Francesco doesn't dive in immediately. That's not his way. He watches first, eyes scanning patterns like a chessboard. The profits are astronomical, yes, but so are the risks. Turf wars, overdose deaths, and law enforcement crackdowns always follow sloppy handling of narcotics. Still, he knows one thing clearly. Ignoring the trade would be fatal. The question is not if he'll enter. It's how. He chooses discretion. Rather than trying to muscle into existing routes, he works through intermediaries. At first, his men only provide safe passage, warehousing, local transport, hush-hush drivers, nothing that would show up in a courtroom photo lineup. Then, once the system trusts him, once the movement of powder flows without friction, he begins to buy stakes in the product itself. One mainstream historical fact: by the mid-2000s, Italy's role in the European cocaine trade had grown significantly. Naples, with its chaotic ports and overworked customs offices, became a key entry point. The Camorra, more decentralized than Sicily's mafia, was uniquely flexible in exploiting this. Francesco exploits it with signature restraint. He never attends the meetings himself. He never speaks directly to the men flying to São Paulo or Medellin, but he approves the budgets. He picks the brokers. He makes sure every shipment is diversified like an investment portfolio, low risk, high return, always layered with deniability. And while the city sees bursts of blood between other clans, Francesco's operations remain strangely clean. There are no turf shootouts under his banner. If a rival dealer steps too close, Francesco doesn't send a hitman. He makes them an offer they can't refuse, structured as a buyout with benefits. Not fear, but absorption. Do you remember the warehouse fire near the Ring Road? Police suspected it was cartel-related. They raided the area, detained a few night guards. But nothing stuck. The paperwork, the lease, even the trucking. Everything pointed in harmless directions. And yet, within days, Francesco's reach in that corridor doubled. That's how he worked. He never stopped the fire, but he always claimed the ashes. His use of legitimate businesses becomes part of his legend. Shipping companies, construction firms, real estate in Calabria. Cocaine doesn't move in backpacks anymore. It moves in pallets and containers marked with forged barcodes and sealed by men who don't know what they're carrying. Francesco turns logistics into camouflage. Many people still think that the Camorra's drug trade was chaotic and driven by impulsive street dealers. But what do you think? Can a man like Francesco Mallardo, who refused to even drive flashy cars, really have moved millions in powder without ever getting caught holding the bag? And then there's the question of harm. Cocaine brings money, but it also brings broken families, overdoses, violence in back alleys. Francesco is no fool. He knows the cost, but in his ledger, pain was part of the math. He saw it like any market force. Unfortunate, but unavoidable. One cousin recalled hearing Francesco once say, "I don't sell dreams or lies. I just make sure people pay for the choices they already want to make." Cold? Perhaps. But in his world, that passed for clarity. He doesn't touch the product. That would be sloppy. But he's in it, deep. And more importantly, he's in it differently. Where others burn bright and crash, Francesco builds slow, buried networks. And the money? It flows in quietly. It feeds new properties, bribes, retirement homes for loyal soldiers. No mansions, no yachts. Just silence and power. That's how a fox works. It doesn't kill for the thrill. It eats only when the trail is cold and no one is watching. There's a rhythm to Naples. The sound of scooters zipping down cobbled streets, shutters slamming in the wind, market vendors shouting prices over the echo of church bells. But in Secondigliano and Giuliano, that rhythm also includes quiet meetings behind construction sites and whispered deals in corner cafes. It's here that Francesco Mallardo moves to expand his hold, not just over people, but over systems. His mind, always tuned to patterns, sees that drug money is only one pillar. Real power, durable power, comes from control over infrastructure, construction permits, sanitation contracts, municipal roadworks. These things don't make headlines, but they last. And more importantly, they offer cover. Do you remember the failed council meeting in 2004 where 2 building contracts were pulled at the last minute? No one ever proved why. But days later, a Mallardo-linked company quietly won both tenders, one for a new school gymnasium, the other for drainage repairs. A coincidence, perhaps? Or the work of a man who could rewire a room without ever flipping a switch in public. Francesco knew that owning corners was old school. Anyone could shake down a bakery or skim from a bar. But owning the roads beneath the bakery, that was evolution. He began acquiring shares, never in his name, through frontmen, nephews, girlfriends of loyal capos. Layer by layer, he slipped into the scaffolding of Naples' north, one mainstream historical fact. During the early 2000s, the Italian government's efforts to invest in underdeveloped southern infrastructure led to an influx of public funds. With that money came opportunities for corruption, subcontracting, and manipulation. Exactly the avenues Francesco quietly paved with his own people. It wasn't just about profit, it was about insulation. Every public project meant contracts, paperwork, payments, all mechanisms that distanced him from the dirty work. While other bosses still counted on thugs with pistols, Francesco relied on men with laptops and forged invoices. He didn't dismantle old systems, he improved them. He made extortion less necessary by making the system itself his client. Businesses didn't have to be threatened. They willingly subcontracted to him because he could deliver faster, cheaper, and with no complications. Many people still think that the Mallardo clan remained a street-level operation. But what do you think? Can a man who avoids nightclubs and never wears a gold chain really be limited to back alley deals? Or was he already playing a different game entirely? Francesco's reach into Secondigliano rackets became most visible when disputes between smaller clans began fading. Not because people had learned to behave, but because he had absorbed them. He invited their leaders to meetings, offered them predictable income, legal fronts, and protection on the condition that they operated within his grid. He wasn't a warlord, he was an engineer. Do you remember the asphalt company that suddenly tripled in size in 6 months? Its office sat in a sleepy industrial park with no signage. Yet it landed every municipal contract north of Naples. The man listed as its director? A retiree who once mopped floors for Francesco's uncle? The man who actually controlled its operations? You already know. But even as his influence expanded, he kept his structure lean. No bloated entourage, no palace, no ego. His soldiers were trained not to draw attention, but to blend. Well-dressed, polite, invisible. And they followed orders because they trusted that under Francesco, things ran on time. He wasn't immune to threats, of course. There were always those who didn't like the quiet takeover. But more often than not, those threats never materialized. Why? Because he offered better math. Join and profit, or resist and fade. Most chose the former. Francesco didn't raise his voice. He raised invoices. And from the cafes of Giuliano to the gravel lots of Secondigliano, the territory slowly bent to his style. Methodical, invisible, inevitable. The fox of Naples North didn't need to roar. He just adjusted the levers until the city moved with him. By the mid-2000s, Francesco Mallardo is a man fully in command of a growing empire, though you wouldn't know it by looking at him. No bulletproof SUV, no cadre of bodyguards swarming behind him. Just a tailored dark jacket, quiet shoes, and a gaze that made most men reconsider their tone. He begins to refine what would become his defining hallmark, a low-profile rule. While other clan bosses make headlines for street wars, Francesco vanishes from public view altogether. There are no fresh photographs, no sightings, not even whispered bar tabs or restaurant slips. He disappears from the physical world and becomes an invisible current running beneath it. His people speak for him, but never as him. Every message passed is vague, deniable. He might be open to that. We'll see what the others say. The fox's genius isn't just in orchestrating moves. It's in making them look like someone else's idea. Even law enforcement notices the silence. The anti-mafia directorate files begin noting an unusual trend. Clans around Giuliano are unusually stable. No murders, no turf disputes, no intercepted threats. And yet, their income rises. Their reach spreads. One mainstream historical fact. Between 2003 and 2007, homicide rates in certain northern districts of Naples dropped, even as drug and contraband profits rose. To outsiders, this seemed like a paradox. But to insiders, it meant only one thing. Someone had imposed order. Francesco's vision of control didn't require gunfire. It required systems. He enforced a quiet code. Dealers stayed in assigned areas. No one acted without clearance. And any disagreements were handled in rooms with closed curtains, not on street corners. It wasn't just efficiency. It was self-preservation. Francesco knew the state didn't fear chaos. It expected it. What it couldn't predict, couldn't model, was silence. And silence is what he gave them. Do you remember the wiretap case where police thought they'd nailed a major player, only to find out the voice belonged to a mid-level lieutenant who didn't even know Francesco personally? That's the brilliance of his design. By the time an officer even thinks they're close, they're already chasing shadows. His soldiers mimic him. Soft-spoken, clean-cut, no tattoos, no drama. Even their language changes. Instead of hits and pickups, they speak in corporate euphemisms. Deliveries, client concerns, logistics delays. The fox turns the streets into spreadsheets. And from his hidden perch, he watches them balance. Many people still think that a true Don must be feared in daylight, must walk openly, like a king. But what do you think? Is visibility really the sign of power? Or is the man you can't find the one you should fear most? Even the local press grows uncertain. Journalists in Naples once published fiery exposés on clan leaders. But Francesco, there's barely a paragraph. Just recycled mugshots from years ago and vague references to suspected financial links. It frustrates the police. It humbles rival clans. It empowers his own men. Because if he can disappear, so can they, if they follow his rules. And Francesco's rules are simple. Never meet twice in the same place. Never bring a phone inside. Never speak names. By now, even those who don't work for him adjust their habits. His influence becomes behavioral. If you operate in Naples North, you operate quietly. And that change, subtle but total, is his fingerprint. There's an elegance to it all, really. Not a throne, but a switchboard. Not a king, but a conductor. And if you were to walk past him on the street, if you somehow spotted him, you wouldn't look twice. That's his brilliance. The real danger never needs to raise its voice. Naples in the 2000s is a chessboard soaked in espresso and static. Every week brings a new move. A clan absorbed, a lieutenant arrested, a shipment seized, or not. But amid the volatility, one player keeps gliding through unscathed. Francesco Mallardo, with his folded hands and fox-like quiet, sits at the center of it all, watching the chaos with disinterest, even calculation. This is not the Camorra of old. The blood feuds, car bombs, and ambushes that once marked territory are slowly being replaced with boardroom takeovers, shell companies, and city councilmen on speed dial. The landscape is shifting, and Francesco is already positioned in its shadows. The politics of the underworld are as delicate as they are treacherous. Francesco, unlike many of his contemporaries, doesn't just fight for turf, he manages equilibrium. When two minor clans in Melito threaten to disrupt a shipping line over profit disputes, it's Francesco's men, unmarked, unnamed, who offer quiet solutions. One gets a better cut on cigarettes, the other a construction subcontract. Both walk away with full pockets and empty pistols. One mainstream historical fact. During the mid-2000s, law enforcement noted a sharp rise in non-aggression pacts between Camorra factions, particularly around Secondigliano. These agreements weren't just coincidental, they were strategic, and many of them bore Francesco's invisible signature. He begins to act more like a broker than a boss. When rivalries surface, he becomes the man others seek, not for protection, but for stability. His opinion carries weight because he rarely gives it, but when he does, it ripples. You might say, perhaps this isn't the best moment to escalate. And suddenly, plans are paused. Guns are reholstered. Do you remember the rumor about the failed alliance between the Verde and Mozzarella clans? It fell apart after a single coffee meeting with Francesco. No threats were made, no conditions spoken aloud, just a glance and a shake of the head. Sometimes that was enough. Many people still think that mafia politics are ruled by fear alone. But what do you think? Can authority flow from quiet reputation rather than violence? Can a whisper really carry further than a scream? Francesco believes so. He operates like fog, soft, shifting, obscuring all hard edges. His alliances are rarely sealed by ceremony. They're forged in favors, compromises, and quiet dinners in seaside villas no one tracks. His own clan, the Mallardos, begins evolving under this new mode of operation. Younger members are instructed in finance, in law, in logistics. Guns are still carried, yes, but they are backup tools, not lead actors. A capo recently said, "We're not soldiers. We're accountants with scars." Francesco starts integrating with the surviving factions of the Licciardi and Contini families, forming what law enforcement would eventually dub the Secondigliano Alliance. To the state, it sounds like a criminal confederation. But on the street, it's simpler. Rules that keep blood off the sidewalks and money in motion. At this point, Francesco is no longer just a clan leader. He's an architect of governance, not in the formal sense, but in the way that really matters in Naples, keeping the wheels turning where the state has stopped. And it's not just about money anymore. His influence stretches into neighborhood associations, church restorations, even minor political appointments. He isn't building an empire. He's shaping an ecosystem. When one of his lieutenants is arrested in 2006, reporters scramble to connect the dots. But the trail ends in fog. Wiretaps show nothing. No recorded orders, no direct contact, just routines that seem to hum forward, with or without him. The brilliance of it all? Even if Francesco vanished tomorrow, the machine would still run. For a while. Because that's how deeply he's woven himself into the gears. He doesn't need to be present. He just needs to have been there once and left his code behind. By 2007, the Camorra's criminal map is littered with smoking craters, arrests, betrayals, internal feuds. But in Giuliano, things remain eerily smooth. The Mallardo clan, under Francesco's unseen hand, hums along like a ghost-operated machine. It's not just unusual, it's unsettling. Even law enforcement begins to question how one of the most profitable corners of Naples stays so quiet. The answer lies in what's not visible. Francesco doesn't flaunt his success. He reinvests it into companies, properties, foreign accounts, and most critically, people. And when the law begins its latest sweep of Naples's criminal landscape, Francesco is already 10 steps ahead. In late 2007 and early 2008, police score a major win. A wave of arrests rips through several Camorra clans, decimating leadership structures. Bosses from the Amato Pagano and Delaro factions fall. Safe houses are raided. Couriers flipped. Dozens of associates vanish into prison vans. But not Francesco. His name doesn't even appear on the early lists. Because when rivals were giving interviews in nightclubs and micromanaging drug corners, Francesco was building distance between himself and the product, himself and the personnel, himself and the paper trail. Do you remember the series of consulting firms that sprang up in Caserta and Aversa around that time? Each one owned by shell companies. Each one hiring low-level logistics coordinators. Each one generating revenue from mysterious transport services. None of them had a storefront. All of them filed taxes. And all of them, quietly, were tied to Mallardo proxies. One mainstream historical fact: Italian anti-mafia legislation strengthened dramatically in the 2000s, particularly with the implementation of new financial tracking laws. But Francesco had already pivoted by then, adapting faster than the bureaucrats could write policies. When rivals fell, Francesco didn't celebrate. He absorbed. Displaced soldiers from other clans were quietly offered work, not as enforcers, but as drivers, warehouse staff, or go-betweens. The catch? Follow Francesco's rules. No visible guns, no tattoos, no shouting in public, no ego. It's not a mob, it's a corporation. And Francesco is the silent shareholder no one meets in person. Many people still think that his lack of arrests in these years was luck. But what do you think? Is it luck when every building contract he touches goes through 3 layers of deniability? When every conversation happens through a man who only knows half of what he's relaying? The arrests of rivals do more than thin the competition. They reinforce Francesco's legend. Other bosses are seen on camera, screaming at judges or dragged into court. Francesco, still unseen, still unmentioned. It's like trying to arrest a shadow, and shadows don't leave fingerprints. One prosecutor, visibly frustrated after a failed raid, said on record, "Mallardo's name is like mist. We know it's there. We feel its chill. But when we reach for it, it's already gone." The truth is, Francesco has built his empire not just on silence, but on timing. He knows when to retreat, when to wait, when to make an offer. When his rivals get sloppy, he tightens. When the police push in, he vanishes into paperwork and business fronts. There are rumors that he briefly leaves Naples during this time, maybe Spain, maybe Brazil, but nothing is confirmed. His phone records are clean, his accounts offshore, his travel documents forged, if they exist at all. Do you remember the story of the plastic surgeon in Lisbon who reportedly altered the appearance of a well-dressed Italian man under a false name? No confirmation, no charges. But local authorities, years later, still whisper the name Mallardo. In these years, his presence becomes mythological. To the street-level dealers, he's more rumor than reality. To his lieutenants, he's instruction on the phone, never face-to-face. To the police, he's a code with no key, and yet the money flows. The order holds. The silence deepens. That's how you know the fox is still there. Some bosses buy power with gold chains and champagne. Francesco Mallardo buys it in votes. By the late 2000s, the fox begins to stretch his influence into a more delicate terrain, local politics. Not by running for office or endorsing candidates. No, that would be too direct, too loud. Instead, he moves through networks already in place. Local unions, family-owned businesses, and community organizers with just enough reach and just enough debt. It starts in Giuliano. A small-time councilman, desperate for campaign support, agrees to use a Mallardo-owned print shop for all his flyers. Then another politician begins hiring contractors linked, covertly, to Francesco's cousins. Before long, entire municipal projects are quietly soaked in the fingerprints of his operation, even though his name never appears. One mainstream historical fact. Italy has long struggled with the intersection of politics and organized crime, particularly in the South. Reports from the mid-2000s showed that dozens of city and provincial councils were dissolved due to suspected mafia infiltration. But Francesco doesn't infiltrate, he blends. His influence doesn't move like an invasion. It moves like humidity. By the time officials notice it, their contracts, staff, and logistics are already saturated. Do you remember the neighborhood revitalization grant awarded in 2009? On paper, it went to a community development group. In practice, the group was managed by a teacher whose brother-in-law ran one of Francesco's courier companies. Coincidence? That depends on how closely you're watching the chessboard. Francesco isn't interested in puppet mayors or dramatic rigging. He's interested in efficiency. A delayed permit can cripple a construction project. A hesitant inspector can block a lucrative contract. But with the right nudges, these problems simply vanish. His lieutenants are instructed to never pressure, only suggest. That family's been helpful. We'd like to keep this project on schedule. It'd be a shame if the budget got reallocated. Not threats, reminders, gentle ones. Many people still think that organized crime only uses violence to gain power. But what do you think? When the outcome is the same and blood isn't spilled, isn't subtlety the more dangerous path? The brilliance of Francesco's political influence is that it never exceeds its bounds. He doesn't ask for laws to be changed. He just wants the gears to move smoothly when his hands are nearby. And so, a few strategically placed allies in City Hall become worth more than 10 armed guards. And they're loyal, not out of fear, but out of debt. Francesco keeps his promises. A campaign contribution here. A problem quietly solved there. Once, he helped arrange for a school janitor to get his job back after an unfair firing. It seemed small, until you realized that janitor's cousin was the assistant to the district assessor. Do you remember the civic center renovation that stalled for 2 years? When the new contractor was finally approved, everything moved fast. No protests, no paperwork delays, just fast cement and smiling photo ops. But the concrete supplier? A Mallardo shell company. Even those who suspect something keep their mouths shut. Francesco's silence is infectious. No one wants to be the one to ask too many questions. And Francesco? He remains distant. He never shows up to ribbon cuttings, never donates in his own name. But when policies shift, when budgets align, when committees vote unanimously, he watches from his villa outside Giugliano, surrounded by lemon trees and high walls. He reads the papers with a satisfied nod. Power doesn't always need to scream. Sometimes it just needs to whisper through the right corridors. The fox understands something others miss. Guns rust, buildings crumble, even money can vanish. But influence lasts as long as people remember why they owe you. And in Naples North, a great many people owe him. Naples has always been a city of teeth. Smiles that hide knives, streets that welcome and betray in the same breath. In that world, Francesco Mallardo didn't wear a crown. He wore shadows, and by now, the city had learned. When the fox moved, it wasn't with spectacle. It was with precision. While rival bosses drove armored cars and barked orders, Francesco made his plays from armchairs, often through men who didn't even know they were pieces. His style was maddening to those who thrived on fear. He wasn't interested in intimidation. He was interested in control. Total, quiet, inevitable. And that meant avoiding violence. In 2009, when a younger capo under his indirect command ordered a rash retaliation over an unpaid debt, Francesco's reaction was not rage, it was removal. The man disappeared from internal operations within a week. Not dead, just irrelevant. Reassigned to a logistics role in Calabria, far from Giugliano. His replacement? A former accountant with no known record of violence, but an excellent understanding of cash flow and construction permits. One mainstream historical fact. By 2010, Italian law enforcement noticed a new breed of Camorra clans emerging. Less interested in street warfare, more invested in laundering, in property portfolios, in mimicking the corporate world. Francesco had helped invent that blueprint. His criminal colleagues struggled to understand him. Some said he was soft. Others called him dangerously smart. Most simply avoided crossing him. Because it wasn't just that he didn't react with fury, it was that he didn't react at all. You made a mistake, and then the door just never opened again. And that silence? That was worse than a gunshot. Do you remember the nightclub incident in Casavatore? A local dealer, drunk and full of pride, bragged that he didn't need approval from Giuliano to run his corner. Within days, his supplier vanished. His landlord raised the rent. Police started showing up twice a week. He lasted a month. Never touched, never threatened. But the floor fell out from under him, one floorboard at a time. That was Francesco's style. A fox never chases. It watches you dig your own hole. Many people still think that power only comes from presence, from being seen, heard, obeyed. But what do you think? When the world bends around someone who never raises his voice, isn't that a deeper form of power? Even the families who disliked him, those who missed the old days of blood and fire, couldn't argue with his results. The Secondigliano alliance thrived. The drugs flowed without disruption. The streets were quiet. The police, while still chasing him, had nothing concrete. Just whispers, paperwork trails, and closed mouths. His rivals, caught in cycles of betrayal and internal war, fell. The De Lauro splintered. The Amato Paganos imploded. But the Mallardos, they endured. Slimmed down, refined, harder to trace. They didn't just survive. They adapted. Francesco had turned his part of Naples into a kind of neutral zone. If you wanted to do business, you followed his rules. No brawls in the street, no reckless ambition, no fire unless he lit it. And in return, stability, profit, peace of a kind. Do you remember the journalist who tried to write a profile on him? 3 months of investigation, dozens of interviews, and in the end, the article ran with a headline that said, "The man not even the streets can describe." Not because people were scared, but because no one had a full picture. They each had a piece, a quote, a favor, a faint memory, but never the whole man. And Francesco liked it that way. He didn't leave footprints. He left arrangements. The flower shop that always had a van parked out front. The accounting office that never filed late. The soccer coach who always had new cleats for the boys, thanks to a silent donor. These were his monuments. Not grand, but persistent. Even the police had to admit, things were better when he was in control. Less blood. Fewer open turf wars. More order. And though they'd never say it publicly, some officers wondered aloud, what happens if he disappears? Because sometimes the devil you know isn't just better. He's the one keeping the ceiling from falling. There's a saying in Giuliano, when you don't know who's running things, it's probably him. By 2011, Francesco Mallardo isn't just a name passed in whispers. He's an absence that shapes presence. A void so meticulously maintained that the city starts molding itself around it. Politicians adjust campaign routes. Construction companies wait for silent green lights. Dealers pace more cautiously. Even rival clans coordinate against each other without ever knowing they're preserving Francesco's peace. This is the height of his quiet reign. His wealth is vast, yet scattered across so many holding companies and offshore trusts that even the most determined financial forensics team could only trace shadows. He doesn't own anything directly, but he controls everything that matters. Flow, permission, silence. One mainstream historical fact. In 2011, Italian anti-mafia forces intensified asset seizures. properties, vehicles, companies, all subject to confiscation if ties to organized crime could be proven. But Francesco's name never showed up on deeds. He didn't leave titles, only influence. By now, his lieutenants understand his methods without being told. Loyalty is no longer a test. It's a culture. He doesn't ask for oaths. He breeds consistency. And for the men under him, that's more binding than fear. Even his mistakes, rare as they are corrected before they become problems. A smuggling route through Eastern Europe gets compromised. It's rerouted within weeks through Belgium. A banker raises questions about a transfer. The banker's firm suddenly lands a long-coveted municipal audit contract. Francesco doesn't punish. He displaces. Do you remember the old beachside hotel that changed ownership 3 times in a year? Each transaction passed through names that led nowhere. But the renovations continued. Contractors were always paid, and bookings never ceased. A washing machine, disguised as a vacation. And yet, no crime ever traced to it. Just another property existing inside Francesco's system. And what a system it had become. Everything with its place. Every favor balancing another. Even internal family squabbles rarely surfaced. Cousins who once might have fought over turf now co-managed shell companies. Wives of soldiers ran daycare centers funded through public grants. It wasn't just the clan. It was a network. Many people still think that organized crime can't coexist with community. But what do you think? When the streetlights stay lit, the garbage gets picked up, and people have jobs. Does it matter who's really pulling the strings? But it's not without cost. The silence starts to feel heavier. Those closest to him begin to live in a state of constant readiness. No one relaxes. No one assumes safety. Francesco's code demands it. Trust only what you can control. And even then, barely. He no longer meets anyone outside his core. Communication flows through triple layers, encrypted phones, handwritten notes, even coded language in family recipes. A cousin once joked that Francesco could run a continent from inside a monastery, and through all this, he never celebrates. No lavish dinners, no champagne toasts, just a quiet nod, a slight breath, a deeper silence. Success, to him, is the absence of collapse, but something is shifting. Law enforcement grows sharper. New digital surveillance techniques emerge. International cooperation strengthens. And while Francesco adapts, the walls begin to move ever so slightly inward. He doesn't flinch. He tightens, reduces his circle, closes the last gaps. And yet, the inevitability begins to flicker on the edge of his map. Still, for now, his grip holds. The money flows, the city behaves, and the fox, ever watchful, still dances between the raindrops. The empire does not roar, it breathes. And as this section of our journey settles into its final moments, let your thoughts drift from the weight of names and numbers. You've walked through shadows tonight, through alleys and whispers, through codes and quiet glances. Let that hush carry you. Let the stillness settle around your chest like a soft coat. The world Francesco built was sharp, sure, but it was also gentle in its rhythm. Order in the underworld. Calm amid the chaos. Even foxes sleep when the trap is set, and no footsteps echo in the woods. So now, breathe slower. Let your muscles uncoil. Picture the flicker of streetlights in Giuliano, the wind tracing dust over stone. The city rests. So should you. Close your eyes. Let the silence hold you. The wind shifts in early 2012. It doesn't howl, it stirs. But Francesco Mallardo, ever attuned to the tremble of leaves, feels it first. Law enforcement has changed. The young officers now speak fluent code, trace bank transfers across borders in seconds, and understand that the modern criminal doesn't wave guns. He hides behind emails and real estate deeds. Italy's Direzione Investigativa Antimafia, DIA, is evolving, and Francesco knows he's being studied in silence. Still, his structure holds. He's eliminated nearly every direct link to his operations. A courier might handle shipments for 10 years and never hear Francesco's name. A lawyer in Switzerland might wire millions and believe it's for a vineyard. That's the genius. But even foxes leave a trail eventually. One mainstream historical fact. In 2012, a renewed wave of anti-Camorra operations began targeting financial crimes, not just drug deals or arms trafficking. Prosecutors began focusing on networks, shell companies, shadow executives, political enablers. The net was no longer cast at foot soldiers. It was aimed at the puppeteers, and Francesco is the puppeteer. Police begin probing deeper into Giuliano's strange stability. How had this district, once flooded with gang wars, suddenly become the cleanest ledger in the Naples underworld? Why were so many business permits processed with unusual speed? Why did certain companies keep winning public contracts without competition? The answers they suspect lead to Francesco, but finding him is another matter. He no longer stays in one place. Homes are cycled through cousins, drivers, and girlfriends. GPS signals are spoofed. Old identities are discarded like used train tickets. Do you remember the house on the outskirts of Campobasso? Perfect hedges, a white Vespa out front, and a mailbox with no name. DIA agents staked it out for weeks, convinced Francesco was inside. But when they raided it, they found only 2 elderly women, a chessboard, and a Bible marked in Latin. The scent of him had passed through, but just that. A scent inside the clan. His commands grow fewer, but more focused. No expansion. No risks. Funnel funds out of Italy. Cut weak links. Every call becomes a calculation. Every silence, a warning. And still, he watches. Even as investigators close in on his proxies, he shifts pressure points. If a front man gets arrested, a new one quietly takes his place. If a safe house is compromised, he moves operations to a neighboring province. It's not luck, it's design. But cracks begin to show. One of his longtime financial handlers, arrested in an unrelated tax fraud sweep, starts talking. Not names, he's too cautious for that, but descriptions, routines, meeting patterns. For the first time in years, law enforcement builds a profile of how Francesco might be moving. Not who he is, but how he exists. They begin stitching together financial flows, money from shell firms in the Netherlands to a shipping company in Puglia to a holding firm in Malta. A trail. Faint. But there, many people still think that Francesco's disappearance from public view meant he was already gone, retired, overseas, a ghost. But what do you think? Does a man build a machine that perfect only to walk away? By late 2012, his inner circle tightens to just 5 men, all longtime associates, all without criminal records, all practically invisible. He doesn't speak to them directly anymore, only through handwritten notes, burned after reading. And yet, his orders still ripple through Naples. A construction delay here, a municipal vote there, a company quietly restructured. The system still breathes, but Francesco knows the wind won't stop. He sees the horizon now, not as an end, but as a bend. He's lasted longer than most, not because he's smarter, though he is, but because he's simpler. He plays the long game, and long games sometimes end, so he prepares. He begins transferring authority, not titles, but influence, training his lieutenants to make decisions, delegate risk, mask footprints, not because he's weak, but because a good fox always knows when to leave the clearing. The walls are closing in, yes, but they're doing so on his terms. By early 2013, Francesco Mallardo becomes the ghost everyone is chasing and no one can see. Yet he's not hiding in the conventional sense. He's present, just never located. Every report that places him somewhere is immediately contradicted by another placing him somewhere else. One day he's supposedly in Marseille, the next in a villa near Caserta. Always nearby, always just missed. He walks through the world like fog, around you, touching everything, but impossible to grab. The DIA continues tightening its net, tracing company registrations, arresting low-level operators, unraveling the layers he spent over a decade constructing. But Francesco has always been ahead of time, not behind it. Each name that falls was already written off, each account frozen, already emptied, each address raided, already stripped bare. One mainstream historical fact. In 2013, Italy's judiciary introduced harsher penalties for association with mafia clans, particularly when tied to white-collar crimes. This new pressure didn't just target soldiers, it hunted their architects. Francesco adapted instantly. His lieutenants were instructed to move their operations abroad, Slovenia, Romania, even distant branches in Uruguay, not to expand, but to vanish. The fox wasn't growing anymore. He was dissolving quietly into places that no warrant reached quickly. Do you remember the cafe in Lugano, where a man resembling Francesco reportedly ordered espresso, left no tip, and disappeared before the waitress returned with change? The surveillance footage was grainy, the timestamps wrong, but someone from the anti-mafia unit insisted it was him. Others weren't so sure. That's how it was now. Glimpses, breath on glass, rumors more persistent than facts. Inside the clan, the change is palpable. Meetings stop entirely. Orders come through disconnected pathways. Soldiers, some of whom have worked in his shadow for years, start to wonder if they'll ever see him again. And yet the money still moves. The structure still functions. That, more than anything, confirms he's alive. Somewhere, watching, guiding. The police, frustrated by years of chasing air, begin focusing on his habits, trying to build a behavioral profile. They don't ask where he is. They ask how he thinks. What newspapers does he read? What time does he prefer to move? What kind of car would he never drive? But the answers change. Francesco doesn't follow patterns anymore. He erases them, changes clothes mid-journey, uses elderly women as message relays, writes notes on paper that dissolves in water. Many people still think that fugitives run because they fear prison. But what do you think? Could a man like Francesco be running because he wants to test how long he can dance through a spotlight without casting a shadow? It's not just survival, it's craft. He begins sleeping in different places each night, never more than once in the same house. Sometimes he stays in homes of childhood friends, people whose names never appeared in his criminal orbit. Sometimes, reportedly, in empty monasteries in Campania's hills, where the only witnesses are walls built 5 centuries before the first mafia oath was ever sworn. His life becomes monastic, No phones, no electronics, food delivered by hand, conversations limited to essentials. A man who once ran a kingdom now lives like a whisper, and yet he's still in control. The clan still follows the structure. Streets stay quiet, no blood spills. It's as if his absence is another form of leadership. His myth, more potent than his presence. Do you remember the intercepted message from a Mallardo associate that simply said, "He sleeps where birds don't fly"? Was it poetic or literal? No one knows. That's the genius of Francesco. He doesn't just evade, he destabilizes certainty. Nothing about him is fixed, not even time. Police still argue over whether an image taken outside Zurich is from 2011 or 2014, because he lives beyond timestamps now, and Naples, in a way, adapts. The police hunt, the people whisper, and the city continues, curious, unsure, reverent, like watching the tide recede, not knowing if it's retreating or about to surge. By the end of 2013, Francesco Mallardo is no longer just a fugitive. He's a symbol. To law enforcement, he's the white whale. To his clan, he's the architect who vanished into the blueprint. And to the city of Naples, he's a whisper on the back of the tongue, half memory, half warning. But behind the silence, the net tightens. The anti-mafia directorate starts leaning on a new strategy. Wiretaps and whispers. Not flashy raids, not theatrical arrests. Just careful listening, patient observation. They know Francesco won't be caught with a gun, but he might be caught in the breath of someone else's mistake. So they listen to construction managers who suddenly get nervous, to accountants who ask the wrong question, to third cousins twice removed who mention the man from Giuliano over espresso and forget they're being recorded. They build a case, not against Francesco directly, but against the ecosystem, the finance, the transport, the votes. Each small revelation, another stitch in the fabric. One mainstream historical fact. By 2014, Italy had increased its investment in digital surveillance infrastructure, particularly in regions like Campania, where organized crime had woven itself deeply into public life. Francesco's world, once so safe in its analog methods, is now surrounded by microphones disguised as ashtrays and satellites that don't sleep. Still, he stays just out of reach. His movements blur between possibilities. One day, a rumor places him on a fishing boat off Ischia. The next, he's seen entering a gated villa in Portugal. Nothing confirmed. Everything possible. Do you remember the tapped call between two logistics workers discussing a shipment no one had paperwork for, arriving at a warehouse owned by a man whose only job was landscaping coordinator? The call was vague, but the voice at the end, calm and clipped, simply said, "Tell him the fox is satisfied." The analysts froze. No names, no identifiers. But the nickname hadn't surfaced in years. Now it did. A slip? A signal? Or just a man reminding the world he was still awake? Inside the Mallardo network, things begin to shiver. The rank and file notice the air getting tighter. A driver gets detained at a checkpoint. A lawyer's bank accounts are flagged. An importer, coincidentally, audited 3 times in a single month. No arrests yet, but shadows moving in the treetops, and Francesco knows. He changes course. Again, he stops communicating entirely, even through intermediaries. Instead, he lets the network guess. He's trained them well. They've studied his style, his decisions, his timing. Now, they must become extensions of him. not just recipients of his command. Many people still think that leadership ends when presence ends. But what do you think? If the machine keeps running, does it matter who turns the key? Or whether the key was ever turned at all? The police keep listening. Wiretaps increase. They hear fear in voices that once spoke with confidence. They hear names danced around, never spoken directly. They hear silence and know it means something. Then comes the breakthrough. One of Francesco's oldest associates, long suspected, never charged, is arrested during a sweep in early 2014. He doesn't break. Not exactly. But he's tired. He answers questions vaguely, shrugs, drops phrases like, "He used to come around," and "that was handled years ago." But one thing stands out. He mentions a farmhouse in the province of Avellino. Quiet, remote, no power lines, no internet, just stone, rain, and fog. Surveillance begins, quietly, over months. Drones, long lenses, intercepted power bills. They find nothing, no movement, no lights, until one night a single window flickers. It lasts 20 minutes, then darkness again. Do you remember the local shepherd who later reported that one of his dogs barked for hours near the same property, only to return limping, covered in gravel dust? He didn't know who owned the farmhouse, said it had belonged to no one for years, but he remembered seeing tire tracks, new ones. The police take note. They double the surveillance. They begin planning something bigger. Meanwhile, Francesco, wherever he is, adjusts. Whether he knows the farmhouse is under watch or not, he begins shifting his final pieces. Offshore accounts are frozen, properties dissolved, loans repaid, old favors quietly erased. He is not running. He is closing. And like any fox, he does not panic in the snare. He simply waits for the silence to break. It begins with a foggy morning in Giugliano, just another Tuesday to the city, but to the anti-mafia directorate, it's the start of something that's taken more than a decade to orchestrate. A coordinated operation, dull in name, surgical in scope, fans across Campania. Officers move not with sirens, but with silence. They aren't just looking for men. They're looking for witnesses, for patterns, for weak spots in a wall built from memory and myth. But the real target is Francesco Mallardo, and yet they still don't know where he is. One mainstream historical fact. By mid-2014, Italian prosecutors launched Operazione Sud, targeting organized crime's financial networks rather than its muscle. Francesco's name, still not officially on any warrant, appeared in over a dozen sealed documents as a figure of interest. They believe he's nearby. They just don't know where. Then, in a moment straight from the cold pages of a spy novel, a courier slips. A small-time logistics handler, arrested for unrelated tax evasion, turns nervous when questioned. He doesn't talk much, but he mentions a routine drop he made to a farmhouse in the hills, blank on details, but enough to spark interest. Do you remember the farmhouse near Avellino? The one where that window flickered just once? The one where dogs barked for no reason? That place is now circled on every DIA field agent's map. They move in with extreme caution. Not guns drawn, not shouting. They wait, watching. Days pass. Then one night, a drone spots a man walking the perimeter, hooded, gloved, alone. A few minutes later, another figure appears in the yard, older, thinner, hair streaked with silver. It's too dark for confirmation, but there's a posture, relaxed, precise, not a wasted step. Someone who isn't hiding out of fear, but out of design. The next morning, just before dawn, they strike. No shots fired, no chase. The man steps out of the house before they enter. No words, no resistance, just a slight smirk. Francesco Mallardo, the Fox of Naples North, is finally in custody after years of being a rumor in courtrooms, a question mark in case files. He is suddenly flesh and bone in a holding cell. The news flashes across Italy. For a moment, Naples holds its breath. Many people still think his arrest was a fluke, that the courier cracked or the drone got lucky. But what do you think? Could a man like Francesco be caught unless he allowed it? Inside the farmhouse, police find almost nothing. No weapons, no files, just some old books, a pair of glasses, clothes folded with care. His fingerprints, only in the kitchen. His phone, non-existent. There's a single notebook filled with phrases in Latin, and a quote on the back page, "Finis venit ut umbra." The end comes like a shadow. The interrogation room is sterile, quiet. Francesco says nothing. His lawyer, already waiting, smiles politely. No statements are made. The court will have to build its case from whispers and proxies. Do you remember the silence in the courtroom on his first appearance? No outbursts, no relatives sobbing. Just Francesco in a plain coat, glancing once at the prosecutor. Not angry, not afraid, just observant. They charge him with criminal association, money laundering, and being the head of a mafia clan. But proof, that's another story. Everything about Francesco's life was designed to vanish in light, and yet he's caught. The clan, for a while, holds its shape. Orders, now passed through coded phrases in lawyers' briefcases, still carry his fingerprints. But over time, something shifts. Quiet cracks, delays, doubts. The fox isn't walking the forest anymore. Still, Francesco doesn't panic. He reads, writes, speaks to no one. The guards report he sleeps well, eats sparingly, refuses television. Some nights he simply sits in the corner of his cell, listening to the hum of the building. Many wonder why he didn't flee further. Why not Brazil or Morocco or somewhere with no extradition? But maybe he knew something others didn't. Maybe a fox doesn't always run to survive. Sometimes it stops to see what happens when the forest learns he's no longer watching. Giuliano does not erupt when Francesco Mallardo is arrested. It exhales. There are no riots, no graffiti tributes, no open mourning in the piazzas. Just a strange stillness, as if the entire district is waiting to see whether the silence left in his wake will hold or crack, because for so long, Francesco hadn't ruled through spectacle, but through consistency. He wasn't a messiah. He wasn't a tyrant. He was an architect. And now the architect is gone. Inside the clan, things don't collapse. Not at first. His lieutenants have been trained for this. Orders continue to circulate. Coded. Deliberate. No one panics. Everyone stays in role. The machine, it seems, runs without its shadow, but beneath the surface, questions begin to bloom. Do you remember the corner cafe on Via Colonna? The one that always closed 5 minutes before police cars passed? Now it stays open. The man who once directed cash flow through a fake seafood business is suddenly nervous. He changes addresses, then names, then disappears. The smallest disturbances, barely visible to an outsider, begin to multiply. Not a collapse. A drift. One mainstream historical fact. After the 2014 arrest of several Camorra leaders, including figures tied to the Secondigliano alliance, Naples experienced a rise in micro-gangs. Smaller, more volatile groups filled the vacuum. Francesco had predicted this. He had built a framework so lean, so elegant, that it functioned like a ghost script in code, an invisible logic guiding actions even without a guiding hand. But logic can't survive doubt, and that's what begins to grow. Among the younger generation, men who only knew Francesco through reputation, ambition stirs. One lieutenant starts asking questions he shouldn't. Another tries to secure an external alliance without clearance. Small moves, but they leave fingerprints. In prison, Francesco receives the reports. Not through phones, through people, through behaviors. A lawyer who blinks too much. A guard who suddenly doesn't make eye contact. He notices. He always notices, and he does nothing, because maybe this too was part of the plan. He'd spent decades preparing for instability, training his men to operate like a cell structure, independent, discreet, minimal risk. But no system is perfect, and once uncertainty enters, it multiplies. Do you remember the dry cleaning shop that burned overnight? The one with no insurance claim? It wasn't a message. It was confusion. A soldier enforcing rules that no longer had clear authorship. Francesco's silence becomes louder, his absence heavier. Some still believe he controls things from his cell. But what do you think? If the leader writes no letters, makes no calls, gives no signs, is he still leading? Outside, Naples begins to shift. New players emerge. Loud ones, hungry ones, men who want the crown Francesco never wore. But they don't understand. The crown isn't a thing you put on. It's a shadow you grow into, slowly, patiently. And in the streets of Giugliano, old habits begin to crack. Bribes that used to be subtle are now clumsy. Contracts once funneled with care now appear under fake names that barely fool an intern. The Polish is fading. Still, some hold the line. A handful of loyalists keep to the code. Quiet, steady. Maybe they still believe he'll return. Maybe they just believe he's still watching. In his cell, Francesco refuses visitors. He speaks only when necessary. He reads, listens, waits. They say he began sketching diagrams in the margins of his books. Not words, just lines, branches, angles, maybe maps, maybe memories. No testimony has pinned him. No definitive evidence has surfaced. His trial creeps forward, slow and uncertain, and even now, years later, prosecutors still struggle to explain how one man ruled without ruling, how silence became strategy, how a fox, long cornered, still refuses to be caught in full, because Francesco Mallardo didn't lead like a man, he led like a system, and systems don't die with the architect. They unravel, gradually, elegantly, until you realize you've been living in its shadow all along. The years slip forward, 1, then 2, then 5. Francesco Mallardo remains in custody, but not in motion. His trial, burdened by bureaucracy and the complexity of prosecuting a ghost, drags like a procession with no music. Lawyers argue, prosecutors gesture, judges shuffle papers, yet the man at the center of it all rarely speaks. He sits with the stillness of a man who has nothing left to reveal, or perhaps nothing to prove. The difference is subtle and entirely the point. Meanwhile, outside, Naples breathes through new lungs. The Mallardo clan still exists, on paper, in habit, in half-spoken names, but its pulse is slower, less certain. Francesco had structured it to survive him, but time erodes everything, even silence. One mainstream historical fact. After 2015, Italy's anti-mafia prosecutions shifted more toward financial and political corruption, indicating a broader understanding of how power moves in shadows, not always in violence. Francesco's case became a symbol of that shift. A man accused not of shootings or smuggling, but of architecture. Do you remember the bank executive in Milan who resigned without explanation just days before being linked to a dormant account holding shell company dividends tied to Giuliano? Nothing was proven, but the timing was sharp enough to raise every eyebrow in the room. That's the story of Francesco now. Not fire, but smoke. Inside the prison, he has aged but not withered. His hair thins, his back stoops slightly, but his eyes remain alert, unforgiving. Still reading the room like blueprints, he receives few visitors, only lawyers, sometimes a priest. Occasionally, someone from the old days comes, hands trembling, unsure whether to bow or accuse. But Francesco only listens, nods, offers nothing. His cell is sparse, a cot, a desk, a shelf of worn books, no photographs, no mementos. One guard swears he keeps a folded map of Naples tucked inside an old copy of The Prince. But when the cell is searched, nothing is found. Outside, the Mallardo brand is mutating. New faces wear the old badges, but their edges are rougher, less cautious. Some want to revive the old power. Others want to carve their own paths. Few understand the code. Fewer still follow it. Many people still think that Francesco's silence is strategy, that he's waiting. But what do you think? Can a man retire from the empire he built? Or is the silence simply all that's left? The authorities remain restless. They still hope for a confession, a misstep, a letter smuggled out. But none comes. Francesco's methods weren't designed to be inherited. They were designed to dissolve, and maybe that's his final move in court when a prosecutor finally asks him directly, "Do you deny orchestrating this network?" He blinks once, then replies, "Which network? It's not sarcasm. It's math. There are too many threads now, too many proxies." Francesco isn't denying guilt. He's denying clarity, and clarity is the one thing law needs to win. Do you remember the way he used to plan expansion? 3 routes, 2 exits, 1 silence. That was always the structure. Now, in prison, the same logic applies. He gives them nothing, and nothing is impossible to convict. Still, Naples moves. The city doesn't wait for old foxes. Streets change. Names fade. New syndicates rise in his place. Not as disciplined, not as elegant, but hungry, and in a small cell under flickering light, Francesco reads, walks in circles, nods at guards who pretend not to be intimidated. But in the silence, he still runs calculations. He doesn't seek freedom. He already has it, the kind most never find. The knowledge that every decision he made deliberately. That he crafted a model few could replicate, and none could destroy. He knows what they don't. Sometimes the quietest man in the room has already walked through the fire and come out shaped like smoke. The hunt is over, but the echoes continue. Francesco Mallardo, long the unseen hand of northern Naples, now exists in court records, archived news clippings, and the steady hum of prison lights. And yet, even in a cell built to contain him, his reach still lingers. The prosecutors never got their headline moment. No sweeping confession, no diagram of command. Francesco never gave them the satisfaction of narrative. He offered only fragments, intentional or not, and the rest had to be filled in by others. What remains is a myth stitched to a man, and outside the city keeps moving. One mainstream historical fact. In 2016, Naples began reporting increasing activity from new Camorra factions that lacked the cohesion of earlier alliances. Violence spiked in some quarters, alliances shattered faster. It became clear that the balance once maintained by strategy, not fear, was no longer sustainable. This was Francesco's greatest irony. The empire he built was too intelligent to last without him. Without his temperament, his measured silence, his refusal to act emotionally, his network began to unravel, not in one swift break, but like threads loosened by weather. Do you remember the warehouse near Lago Patria, the one that had quietly handled imports for years without incident? After his arrest, there were 5 disputes over its control. 2 ended in gunfire, the 3rd in a police raid, the 4th in silence. The 5th, it was torched. Insurance expired. Francesco had always hated fire. Too visible, too final. Inside prison, he learned patience in a new form. The structure of the days didn't bother him. He followed routines like they were blueprints. Up at 6, walk at 7, books at 9, silence after lunch. He treated incarceration like architecture, something to study, shape, navigate. He rarely wrote. When he did, it was in codes even his attorneys struggled to understand. Not codes of crime, but of thought. Observations about how systems fail, how people default to chaos, how empires erode not from outside pressure, but from within. He seemed unbothered by the collapse of his network, as if he expected it. Many people still think that Francesco mourned the end of his reign. But what do you think? Could a man who never chased glory truly be haunted by its passing? What he built was never meant to outlive him. It was meant to work, and it did, for decades, long enough to change the rhythm of a city, long enough to teach his enemies restraint, long enough for prosecutors to admit, privately, that order had been easier when he was free. That was always the trick. He didn't lead with power, he replaced it, gave the city a kind of quiet predictability, a crooked clock that, strangely, kept time. But clocks don't run forever. In the aftermath of his capture, the men who filled his space were louder, sloppier, and quicker to bleed. The second-tier capos tried to replicate his model, but lacked the patience. One hired a PR consultant, another bought a football club. All of them forgot the most important lesson. The fox is most dangerous when no one sees him coming. Francesco, meanwhile, aged in stillness. The gray deepened, his hands thinned, but his mind, unchanged. Prisoners described the way he listened, fully, quietly, as if decoding the air. He asked few questions, offered fewer opinions. When young inmates asked if he was Francesco Mallardo, he sometimes just smiled. Other times, he simply replied, "Not anymore." Do you remember the guard who claimed he once heard Francesco laugh at night, alone in his cell? No one believed him. But the sound stuck. He wasn't broken. He wasn't angry. He simply was. He had become the final version of himself. A man who no longer needed influence to matter. A man who had written the structure of a world and now watched it unravel without remorse. To him, the end had always been part of the architecture. Years pass. Francesco Mallardo remains exactly where they left him, inside a quiet cell with no view, no window, and no need for either. The world moves on without him. New names climb the criminal ladder in Naples, but few are remembered. They make noise. They take risks. They fall. The city forgets quickly now. Francesco is not forgotten. He is recalled, not in newspapers, but in tone, in caution. When young Camorristi get too bold, someone always whispers, "That's not how Mallardo would have done it." One mainstream historical fact. By the late 2010s, the Italian state began to win more consistent victories against organized crime in Campania, seizing assets, making arrests, and dismantling fragile alliances. But none of the new leaders ever had Francesco's staying power. In Giugliano, people still speak of the days when things worked, when police came less because streets were stable, when buildings went up on time, when silence was a signal, not an absence. They weren't praising the mafia. They were mourning the strange calm that once came with it. Inside, Francesco declines, slowly, gracefully, not in body, but in necessity. He no longer reads court filings, no longer asks for updates. When lawyers visit, he listens politely, but waves off strategy talk. His eyes wander to the wall, not out of boredom, but because he's already beyond the game. Do you remember the rumor that he gave a single interview, off record, unrecorded, to a prison chaplain? The chaplain, when asked, only said, he talked about windows. And when pressed further, he added, he said a man's real sentence begins when he stops wanting to escape. Francesco had already served most of his sentence before his arrest. The solitude, the caution, the endless discipline, that was the cage. Prison simply offered a roof, and yet he watches. Still, he listens to the guards' radios, noting tone shifts. He hears stories from younger inmates, clumsy robberies, messy turf wars, betrayals over phones. He doesn't scoff. He just files it all away, as if still building something in the corners of his mind. Occasionally, a name from the old days surfaces. Someone he once mentored, now lost to violence or custody. He reacts only with stillness. Regret? Possibly. But never surprise. Many people still think that time breaks all men. But what do you think? Can a man who built his life around vanishing ever truly be undone by solitude? He begins giving away his books, one by one, always folded neatly, always passed with a phrase, use it well. One day, the priest finds a note on his bunk, not addressed, not signed. It reads, better to be forgotten entirely than remembered incorrectly. Outside, Naples forgets nothing, but it misremembers often. They say he was ruthless, or gentle, that he saved lives, or destroyed them, that he loved order or chaos, that he died years ago, that he's still pulling strings. All of it may be true, none of it matters. Francesco has become myth, and myths don't argue with the details. They simply persist. In his final known court appearance, called unexpectedly for a procedural hearing, Francesco walks slowly to the stand. The judge, young and eager, asks him to confirm his identity. Francesco looks up, pauses, and says, I used to be. Then he smiles, small, unreadable, and says nothing else, because now, finally, he is nothing. And in that, he is free. The city changes. Giugliano paves new streets. Apartment blocks rise where old safe houses once stood. Cafes fill with students instead of lookouts. The names Mallardo, Licciardi, Contini, they fade from daily talk, replaced by influencers, football scores, and the price of groceries. But beneath it all, Naples remembers. Not in headlines. In habits, a building contractor still checks which councilman approved a permit. A neighborhood priest still glances twice at donations without names. A teenager delivering pizzas notices which alleyways stay too quiet at night. Francesco Mallardo never asked to be remembered. And now, years after his last trial, there's no monument, no mural. Yet his legacy lingers, not in marble, but in instinct. One mainstream historical fact. By 2020, Italy's national anti-mafia task forces began focusing more on organized crime's psychological influence over territory, its power to condition communities, not just threaten them. Francesco, perhaps more than any other figure of his generation, embodied that quiet hold. In prison, the years taper into sameness. Francesco still walks, still reads, still listens. But those who visit say there's something softer about him now. Not weaker, just untethered. Like a man finally living inside the quiet he spent his whole life building. Do you remember the story about the retired officer who once spent 5 years chasing Francesco's financial web? After his retirement, he was asked in an interview, "If you met Mallardo now, what would you ask him?" He replied, "Nothing. I just want to know if he ever slept well." A fitting question, because that's the paradox of Francesco, the man who kept an entire city from tipping into chaos by never letting himself rest. Inmates who serve with him say he rarely dreams, that he wakes always at the same time, that he folds his sheets with military precision, that he watches the window even though it only opens a crack. Many people still think that men like Francesco either rot or repent. But what do you think? Is it possible for a man to end his life with neither guilt nor pride? Because he shows neither, only completion. Sometimes, when walking in the yard, he stops and traces invisible shapes in the dust with his foot. Angles, arcs, lines. A guard once joked that he was planning an escape. Another said, "No, that's just how he thinks. Even now he's designing something, maybe, or maybe he's remembering a life that required design, a world of careful balances, quiet networks, streets that stayed peaceful not because of law, but because one man had drawn an invisible line, and everyone knew not to cross it. Now that line has faded. The Mallardo clan still exists, but like an echo shouted into wind. Its younger members lack Francesco's touch. The streets feel louder, riskier, even greedier. His rules, once taken as gospel, now seem quaint to a generation raised on fast money and faster betrayal. Francesco notices this too. On the rare occasion he comments, he says only, "They want to win before they understand the game." A fox doesn't speak often, but when it does, the forest still leans in. In one final interview, granted under strict conditions to an investigative author, Francesco is asked if he regrets building what he built. His answer is quiet, measured, and razor sharp. "I didn't build it to last. I built it to survive." And with that he stands, nods once, and walks away. The final years of Francesco Mallardo's life do not arrive with violence, drama, or breaking news. They arrive in the quiet way he always preferred. Without announcement, there is no sudden collapse, no riot in the prison yard, no tearful statement from distant relatives. Just the routine of a man who has already lived 3 lifetimes inside his own shadow. One morning, a guard brings his breakfast. Francesco does not stir, not out of stubbornness, not out of arrogance, just stillness. A doctor is called, then a warden, then silence. He passes away in his sleep, sometime between midnight and dawn, in a small concrete room with no windows. The cause is listed as cardiac arrest. The press reports it in a single paragraph. Francesco Mallardo, long considered the head of the Mallardo clan and a figure in Naples' organized crime history, died in prison at the age of 75. He had been serving time since his arrest in 2013. No further details, no public funeral. Do you remember the day the news broke? The streets of Giuliano didn't flinch. No flags at half-mast, no candlelit altars. But in 3 cafes, old men lifted their espresso cups in silence. In one alley, a bouquet appeared. No note, no name, just lilies in a rusted tin, because for those who truly knew, Francesco wasn't a ghost. He was a boundary, a design, a tension that had kept Naples' north from becoming something far worse. After his death, law enforcement sighs, relieved. But even they admit, some aloud, some only in thought, that he had been the only thing holding back a wave of volatility. His absence is not peace. It is a vacuum, one mainstream historical fact. By 2023, the Secondigliano Alliance, once Napoli's most stable criminal consortium, had fractured entirely. Smaller factions began warring again. Murders rose. The order that Francesco had imposed through silence was gone, and many people still think he was simply a boss. But what do you think? Was he a criminal or an architect of something few dared to admit Naples needed? What remains of his life is fragments. A locked notebook, a rumored safe deposit box, and a prison bookshelf, emptied by the warden and boxed for evidence. There are no memoirs, no farewell letters, no final words, but somewhere, perhaps in an old file or a line of code in a wiretap transcript, his logic still lives. The rules he crafted still echo, because Francesco didn't want to be remembered. He wanted the system to endure, even if his name was erased. And so the fox sleeps, not in fear, not in shame, but in completion. You've walked with shadows tonight, not through firestorms or flashing headlines, but through something more intricate. The slow, deliberate construction of a man's empire, not with bombs, but with blueprints, not with shouting, but with glances. Let the weight of his story settle like fog now. Not heavy, just present. A reminder that some men don't raise kingdoms to be worshipped. They raise them to be left alone. And Francesco Mallardo? He was the kind of man who learned the shape of power without ever needing to say it aloud. The kind who made silence feel like a contract and order feel like a favor you didn't know you owed. Now, that silence belongs to you. Let it press gently against your skin, like soft cloth. Let the edges of the story blur, the way city lights do when rain begins to fall. You don't need to remember every name or every deal, just the quiet, just the way he moved, without needing to be seen. So breathe deeper now, slower. Let the hush become more than a pause. It becomes a place where streetlights flicker over closed shutters, where espresso machines hiss in the dark, where even the fox has stopped pacing. Sleep comes easier when the noise is done, and now the noise is done.